All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Creig, and with me I have Joel Richards. And I'm just going to ask Joel to unmute his mic and tell you a little bit about him because this is a young man that has come through the. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Creig, and with me I have Joel Richards. And I'm just going to ask Joel to unmute his mic and tell you a little bit about him because this is a young man that has come through. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joel Richards. And I'm just going to ask Joel to unmute his mic and tell you a little bit about him because young man comes through. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is I'm just going to ask Joel to unmute his mic and tell you a little bit about him because this is a young man. All right, so I think we were having a little bit of a feedback problem there. Joel to unmute his mic and tell you a little bit about him because this is a feedback problem there. One more time. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session on investing. And we're going to be talking about investing in the church and how the church can invest, and what are some of the ways that it can find alternate means of really developing itself. On our panel today, we have Joel Richards. We also have Jeanelle Alfred, who is going to be joining us a little later on in the session. And I'm going to invite Joel to unmute his mic and to share a little bit about himself. If you were listening to the loop before, you would have heard me go on to say that Joel is a young man that would have come through the ranks of the church. He would have been very instrumental in the Youth Commission, the National Youth Commission in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Professionally, he is a trade expert, and he is also a local preacher in training in the Methodist Church. So let me welcome Brother Joel. Tell us about yourself a little bit more. I've given a little introduction, but share with us a little bit more about yourself.
Thank you very much, Creig. Good afternoon to everybody. And Creig, I wasn't sure if I should still say anything after, but it's good to see you. And just to say that Creig and I go way back. I think I first met Creig around I think 98, I believe, in 1998 at District Camp in St. Lucia, and then again in 2002 at Youth Encounter in Antigua and Barbuda, and have managed to, keep in touch over the years. So it's good to see you again, Creig. As Creig indicated, I'm Joel Richards. I'm from St. Vincent and the Grenadines originally. I would have spent the majority of my adult life in Barbados. So I spent 12 years living in Barbados. I've graduated from the University of the West Indies Mona campus, and would have worked and pursued further education in Barbados as well. Would have completed my master's there. And for the past 3.5 years, I've been living and working in Switzerland, in Geneva, where I am with the mission of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States to the international organizations in Geneva. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm still very much a Methodist, still very much interested in the life and work of the Methodist Church, and still very much passionate about God, and still love the Lord and trying my best to serve the Lord. And as Creig indicated, I've been a local preacher on trial. I haven't yet been able to complete the trial stage because I've sort of been transient over the years, moving around quite a bit. So I haven't been able to complete that. But I would have also been a local preacher on note in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Kingston Chateau circuit. And was very involved in the Youth Commission. I would have been president of the Methodist Youth Commission in St. Vincent and the Grenadines for a number of years, back in the early to mid 2000s, I believe. I would have done that, and that's pretty much about it. And of course, if there are any other questions, I'll be happy to respond. So thanks, Creig.
So, as it relates to our topic at hand, the smartest way to invest in the future. I think this is a very, very broad topic. I just wanted to get your initial thoughts on, do you think that as a church, we are investing smartly at this point in time as it relates to our future?
Okay, so yes, so as you said, very broad question. I'll probably give a very broad response and try to narrow it a bit. I think over the years, the church has done a commendable job in terms of investing in the future. And I want to look at investments in a very broad sense, and of investments in the people, in the sheep, in the flock. Also thinking about investments as it relates to physical, financial type of investments. Now, I think you and I both, Creig, products of the kinds of investment that the Methodist Church has made over the years in its flock. I was very fortunate to have participated in several youth, regional, and MCCA wide youth events. So I mentioned before, I was at District Camp in St. Lucia in 1998. I was at Youth Encuentro in 2002. And I recall growing up as a young boy, every summer there was camp that we all looked forward to. And I think that the Methodist Church sort of set a very good foundation for me personally to develop as a young man and help to shape the person I am today. I think it provided lots of opportunities for me to be involved in leadership. And I think those sorts of exposures would have contributed to how I performed at school, how I, the individual I became as I transitioned from being a young person into a young adult and now progressing eventually beyond the young adult stage. So I would say the church has done a good job over the years. Whether or not it's been able to sustain that, I am not entirely sure. Because of course, as we all are aware, the church has, several challenges, financial and otherwise, and I'm not sure if the capacity remains for the church to do some of the things that it would have done in the past. For example, a lot of the youth camps that I participated in, the fees would have been nominal, and in many instances, my home congregation, along with the circuit, the district, would have come together and paid for me to be involved, because as a poor kid growing up, couldn't afford it on my own. And so the church would have stepped in and done that. Whether or not it's in a position to do that for the mass of young people today, that's another story. I recall in the late 90s, early 2000s, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the district would have, and led by the Kingston Chateaublais circuit at the time, and what became wider district projects, where the church invested in real estate. So if you are in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, you hear about the Methodist Church Hall, which is almost a name recognition, and that's because so many conferences, national, regional, international conferences, have been held at the Methodist Church Hall, and that was an investment that the church made, not just in the church but in the nation at the time. And then there's the Methodist Administrative Complex, which is uptown in Kingston, which houses several government ministries and departments and offices. So the church would have made those kinds of investments in real estate at that time. And I think those have done fairly well. And those are the kinds of investments I think we would like to see the church making more and more of. So I think over the years, yes, there's been some very positive developments. But where we are today, I'm not entirely sure if we've been able to sustain those kinds of investments in our human and capital as well as in terms of the physical assets of the church.
So I think you raise a very important point. Well, not just one point, but many important points. And I think some of that has to do with along the line as a church, we stop investing in our people. I think somewhere along the line, we got caught up as a church in maintenance. So, we're all about maintaining our buildings. We're all about, raising funds and all of that stuff. And we haven't really invested in our young people, teaching them the skills and the tools that they need, not only to be effective within the church, but to be effective in society. You pointed out that you are where you are today because the church invested in you. So I think somewhere along the line we have stopped doing that, and I don't think it needs to be something that is costly. I think that there are ways that you can invest in your people. There are ways that you can help develop your children. I mean, I know that there are many times when I was involved in youth work, not as much these days, but every single third Sunday, that you have to take part in worship, lead worship, and we would just as a youth group, you know, hurriedly try to find somebody who's like, all right, you go and you read the lesson, you go and conduct worship, instead of actually having training and teaching, the young people, okay, well, this is how you start off when you're saying, well, this is the gospel, this is what needs to happen afterwards, or even when you're leading worship, this is how you lead worship, this is how you dress for worship, you dress for worship this way because you don't want to be distracting, all of these things. I think we just throw people off at the deep end and hope that they would figure it out. So that's a very crucial thing. We need to invest in our young people. And in addition to that, I'm also curious about ways in which we can, become self-sufficient as a church. So one of the major things that we've always heard over the years is that before we had the current form of the MCCA, there was an attempt where the Methodist Church in the Caribbean tried to go on its own, but financially it failed. And so when we started off the MCCA some 60 plus years ago, um, the British Church, they gave us money to really prop us up. And that money was on a reducing type of situation. So every year, the amount reduced until finally it got to zero. Not that we're no longer getting money from the British Church. We're struggling again. What are some of the ways that you think that as a church we can creatively, invest in the future? And you mentioned some of the things that would be happening in St. Vincent, where you know some leaders at the time saw the benefit of having the church hall or having the administrated buildings that you can rent to government and gain an income. Like, what are some of the things that you can see us as a church doing to become a little bit more self-sufficient instead of trying to rely only on collection and fundraisers?
Yeah, and very good question. And several ways to look at it. First, I think there has to be an amount of, so I think the church needs to engage in a process of what I would call horizon scanning or future scanning. So the church needs to have an appreciation of where our economies are heading, what are the types of industries which are likely to emerge, what are the kinds of services sectors which are likely to emerge, what are the areas in which economic activity is likely to become more robust. And then after doing that kind of horizon scanning analysis, I think the church then needs to do sort of a mapping of all of its physical assets. Okay, so how much land is in the church's possession? How many buildings are in the church's possession? And so do a mapping of all of its assets, its physical assets. And on the basis of that horizon scanning, You then match the outcome of that process with the assets that have been identified, and then you come up with a strategy in terms of how to best maximize those assets. And let me give some examples. So, right now, the world is experiencing a food crisis. There's a food insecurity crisis, which the world is facing at the moment. Is it that the church has, across our district, across the MCCA, acres and acres of land that we can put into actual productive use in terms of one, can we lease it for agricultural purposes? Okay, so that the church can play a role in contributing to food security in our region and earn income, also contributing to solving a public good. Uh, is it possible that even when you think of tourism, that some of the physical assets that the church has can actually be converted into sort of assets that that sort of plugs into the national tourism infrastructure. And here I'm talking about perhaps condominiums and those sorts of things. And what about healthcare? So I remember, I think a year and a half ago, I did a presentation where we looked at some of these issues as it relates to the church. And across our region, across the South Caribbean district, the MCCA, healthcare is a big issue. Uh, Access to quality healthcare is actually declining in our region. Is it that the church can, for example, invest in health centers, health facilities, hospitals, laboratories, and those sort of things on the basis of the assets that it currently has, and use those to make a positive contribution to society, but also to also put the church on a sustainable economic. And of course, there's the broader issue of how we respond to the climate crisis. And a number of climate sensitive industries are actually emerging at this time. And you are now hearing about sustainable investments, responsible investments in areas such as renewable energy, for example. Is it that some of the assets, the physical assets that the church has, some of the land space that it has, is it that we can convert some of that into areas where we can set up solar farms, for example, and feed that into the national grid and sell the excess? You know, is that something that we can do as a church? So I think we need to engage in an exercise of, as I said, we need to scan the horizon, look at the different sectors which are emerging. We need to match those with the assets of the church. And then we need to come up with a strategic approach in terms of which of the assets that the church has in its possession are most bankable, and then pursue developments in those areas. So that's my very long-winded response to your question, Creig.
So I see that we are joined by Joel. And so I'm just gonna ask Joel. I mean, Joel had the opportunity to introduce himself, say a little bit about himself. I'm just gonna ask you to share a little bit about yourself and then jump right into your thoughts on ways in which the church can invest in itself, in others for the future.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Just let me know if you are hearing me clearly.
Yep, we are.
All right, great. So I am Reverend Joelle Alfred. So same name as our other speaker, but mine is spelled in the French female, so it's Joelle. And I recently graduated from the United College of the West Indies. So I just basically finished the first part of my training. I have been working with youth for the past 13, well, more than 13 now, maybe about 16 years. I would have been teaching at the high school level for 13 of those years. I was a Spanish teacher, still am actually. And I have been working with children and youth in the Methodist Church for that period as well. I enjoy working with children and youth. Sometimes it can be frustrating. We know how we can be as young people. especially when it comes to working with our elders, some of whom are not easy to get along with. But as leaders, it's our responsibility to make it work, regardless of how much time and effort that may take. So, enough about me. In terms of investing, many of the points that Joel raised would have been similar concerns that I had. Coming from an experience where, for example, I am from the Tobago circuit, and my home congregation is the Mount St. George congregation. And the amount of land that used to belong to the church and has been given to family of, past members of the church, it's a very, very large expanse. But the church doesn't benefit from any of that, really. Because even the families that are living there, they're not necessarily paying rent, they're not doing anything. So the church doesn't get anything from it. But it doesn't mean that the church doesn't have lands. Part of the challenge in the Tobago context and maybe across the region as well is that many of those lands would have been gifted to the church by senior members who would have passed on. But because that was not regularized, there is nothing to show that these lands actually belong to the church. So you find that in an event where you want to do some sort of development, because there would have been discussions about having developments, putting up buildings that the circuit could use to do different activities, you realize that in order to get permission to develop on the lands, you need a deed, and the church doesn't have the deed. I know in the Jamaica district, that was also of concern as well, where you would find that there are relatively small congregations, but the circuit itself has a lot of land. And the circuits are crying out because they don't have any money, because traditionally, the way that the church invested was through the offering of members. Many of our members, sadly to see, are either elderly or young children, so they're not in the working bracket. So if we continue to depend on tithes and offering as our sole means of, financial investment, then anyway, what are some of the things that we can do? Utilizing our church properties is one of them. And in some instances, that doesn't require a lot of infrastructure because the infrastructure is already there. I think one of the challenges that we have as a church is poor management. It's not that we don't have the resources, but we're not sure how to use them. So we have church halls that lie dormant for the majority of the year. Maybe if you have a funeral and it's a well-loved elderly member, they may use the church hall because of the amount of persons. But aside from that, and maybe one or two special events, the halls lie dormant, not being used. What can we do to ensure that these properties, these spaces are being used? I know in some rent buildings to business places. So every month, that is something that is coming in. What is preventing the other circuits from doing the same? I would say a lack of vision, holding on to tradition. We're very uncomfortable as Methodists to let go of tradition. So if it wasn't done that way before, we don't want to be the first one to do it that way because, we may be criticized or persons may think that we're Methodists or, whatever other reasons that we are afraid to embrace new things. And I think that is our biggest challenge, Creig, that we are a bit afraid to embrace new things for whatever reason, maybe because we believe that we'll lose our identity as Methodists. But as I like to remind persons, John Wesley was a rebel. He didn't preach in church because they kicked him out, point blank. So he had to preach on the steps and, in the open air and out in the fields where the sheep and the goats were because he was banned from the church. But we are stuck to the four walls of the church, and anything that is outside of that is hard for us to imagine. So it requires a change of mind, being open to new and non-traditional ideas of what it means to be church. And I think once we get to that point, then everything else would, just kind of flow. because we'll get accustomed to doing things a little differently. So it's not going to seem strange when somebody comes and says, "Oh, we have a plot of land. Let's open a restaurant. We have 5 grannies who cook, where every time they cook, people say the food tastes good, and it becomes a community space. Persons come, they eat, they fellowship. I hope we get to that place and get to that place soon. I mentioned we're talking about food security. It's a challenge everywhere, where persons wonder, how are we going to feed ourselves? They talk about the backyard gardens. How many of us plant anything aside from lettuce? You can't live on lettuce alone. How many of us rear animals? It's a bit more difficult because animals require a bit more care. But if each family is self-sufficient, then as a people, we are self-sufficient. So it takes us, and I do mean us as young people, being willing to step out and say, I am going to be different. They may look at me funny, some of the members may stop speaking to me, but if we don't do it, who will? And with that, Craig, I'll rest my case for now.
Thank you very much. One of the things I think we also need to look at is there are restrictions within the church as it relates to what we can invest in. So, for example, we do know that we can't invest in certain products. So, as it relates to insurance products, annuities, etc., there are restrictions. And a lot of that has come out as it relates to the church's experience having invested in some of those products from insurance companies, and the church would have lost money. And so they have put restrictions on that. We also know that the church has a positive rule now that if you sell a property, you cannot just use that money and flip that money away. You have to invest that money. So whether it is that you buy another property or you find another way of investing it, you just can't sell off a resource and do something else with the money. You have to find a way of investing it in the future. So one of the things I want to really talk about is what are some of the things, some of the new secure methods of investing do you see the church having the ability to use? I mean, we've talked about real estate as one way of investing, but what about some of the new forms of investment, whether it be in Bitcoin? Do we see that as being too risky? Or what are some of the creative ways that we can invest in a church? And I throw that to everybody.
Yeah, again, good question. I think the church still has a responsibility to invest with a conscience and to be guided by its spiritual ethos. And so there's certain kinds of investment I would wish for the church to stay away from. And I think the church would have to be very judicious in terms of how it goes about these things. But I would say the church should primarily focus perhaps on responsible, sustainable, ethical types of investments. And I'll go back to the point I made earlier in terms of investments in climate, investments which are geared towards responding to the climate crisis, for example. There are a number of governments across the world, and increasingly so in the Caribbean, which, for example, are issuing blue bonds, green bonds as a way of financing climate risk mitigation, adaptation, and all of that. I think there's scope for the church to look into investments in those areas. And when you look at some of the reports coming through from the World Bank and the IMF, you'd realize that these types of financial products are actually growing and increasingly are being backed by some of the major international financial entities, as well as being backed by very big companies as well. So I would say that is in terms of Bitcoin, which you mentioned, I'm personally cautious when it comes to that because it's still very opaque. It's still conduit for activities which might not necessarily be above board. And so that's one where the church may have to be extremely judicious in terms of how it pursues it. But I believe that as that space, the fintech space, becomes more regulated, more transparent, I believe opportunities would also open up. Because as a church, we have to also be progressive and forward thinking as well. But I would also go back to a point I made earlier, because I will maintain that the biggest investment that the church can still make is investment would be investments in its flock. And I think that we have to make some serious investments in our young people. And I think when you do that, you're also safeguarding your future because we have to also be careful that we don't end up in a situation where we have millions and millions of dollars worth of investments, but we have empty churches. We have nobody, right? And so we have to be very balanced in terms of how we go about thinking of investing, where to invest, what, and whom. And I think the best investments we can make are those investments in our people, in their education, in their health, um, in their training, in the kinds of opportunities that can be provided. Focus on that, but at the same time focus on the sustainability element in terms of making sure that we have the finances to continue to run the church.
Reverend Joel, I don't know if you want to respond to that, especially the point where Joel raised the issue of investing in our people. How do you see us as a church investing in our people that will benefit us in the future? And I let you take that as a minister.
I mean, I have some ideas. I don't know, because I'm not a finance person, what may be some of the challenges or the legalities of it within our context as a church. But as Joel was speaking, it came to mind that in many of our societies coming out of our ancestry as an enslaved people, whatever we may call it. That's how the cooperatives or the credit unions were born. Here in Tobago, we call it susu. I think in Barbados and some places they call it lend hand, where the concept is basically every month, persons they come together as a group, they decide what the hand or the each person's takeaway for the month is going to be. If it's $1,000, $500, and every month persons contribute that. And at the end of each month, there is one specific person or two persons who would receive, let's say a specific amount. So let's say, for example, you're running it for a year, and the individual contribution is $1,000. You have, let's say, you have 10 persons. So at the end of the month, one person would receive $10,000. That is how some persons save. I used to do that. So I'm not telling you about what I've heard. I'm telling you about what I myself have done. It's a way of investing, borrowing, lending without interest, without any of those. Persons would have used that to build their homes. Because for some persons, that's how they save. Putting money in a bank these days isn't making much sense because you don't get much returns for it. What is preventing the church from becoming or having as part of its financial thrust some sort of cooperative or church savings where persons invest in each other, because you're basically investing in each other when you do something like that. So that's just one idea that came to mind. So for example, one of the congregations may need to purchase a car. They take a loan from another congregation. You don't have to worry about the interest. So each one is helping the other one. And that is one way that we can develop each other. So that's something that we can think about for those financial persons out there. The other thing that I want to mention, and I do agree with what Joel said, is that I don't think we pay enough attention to channeling our young people into careers that would help not only themselves but the church. So, for example, we speak about other churches, whether we condemn or we congratulate, that have persons in basically every possible field that you can think of. Do we do that as Methodists? So, do we see our young people and say, um, the church needs musicians? Do we encourage persons to go into music? We have schools across the connection. Do we encourage our young people to become teachers? We have hospitals in some places, hospitals or health centers. Are we encouraging our young people across the district, across the connection, to become doctors or nurses? We are having a lot of financial challenges, and the banks, their policies are changing, laws are changing. Are we encouraging our young people to become and to become real estate agents? Are we encouraging our young people, training our young people in these different areas? Because if we do that, that's an investment. Because these are new ministries that we can now start. So I know, for example, some circuits have what they call a legal advisory bureau. I don't know how many of the lawyers who um, contribute their time are Methodists, but it's a Methodist ministry. Some places have a clinic. How many of the nurses and the doctors in our clinics are actually Methodists? In our schools, how many of our teachers are Methodists? So we're struggling for principals across the connection, because in order to be a principal, you have to, of course, first be a teacher. But our young people aren't going into teaching. All of this is a way of investing in our people. Because if we want to have a church that is financially viable, but if we want to have a church that more so is saving souls, because that is our aim, at the end of the day, we want to be able to lead friends to Christ. But as Joel correctly said, if our churches are empty, we have nobody to preach to. So we develop new ministries. Persons are interested in professional development. How do we encourage that as a church so that when persons come back, they find that there is somewhere in the church for them? I think it's an area that we are falling down on severely. I can tell you from my experience before I was called into the ministry, I didn't know that I was being called to be a deacon, because it's not something that we preach about. It's not something that we talk about. When persons hear minister or reverend, they think about someone up in the pulpit who is going to administer communion, who is going to bring down heaven with a lovely sermon. Everybody can shout amen. But what about the persons like myself who are called to serve? So we aren't called to be on the pulpit, so to speak. We are called into different ministries, into different areas of work. Are we encouraging people into working in and for the church? You see, the money is just one of the symptoms, but it's not the real problem. And I think if we spend the time investing in showing all people that what we have been doing is not all that there is, we will continue to be in problems. So, we're concerned about the symptom of financial instability, but that isn't the actual problem. That's just one of the symptoms. So I think we need to get to the roots, to the fact that we are not reaching our people. Persons leave and they go to other churches, and you see them in ministries and you wonder, but this person was in the Methodist church and they never did XYZ. They probably didn't know that that was an option. I'm sad to say. So we invest in our people, not just giving them a grant or a scholarship, or the financial aspects of it, but encouraging persons to develop themselves, and in doing so they develop their families, their communities, and we will see the growth that we want to see in the church. My humble opinion.
That was definitely a lot of food for thought. Um, and I want to touch on something that you said. So I would have served as a circuit steward. And one of the things that really was an issue for a lot of the congregations, and we really had a very strong circuit type of structure where the congregations were paying their money into the circuit. And in theory, the combined pool of money um, really helped the circuit to be able to pay its bills. So this is just outside of the congregations paying their assessment to help pay ministers, to help, keep the car, to pay gas, etc. The general circuit expenses. But where there would have been surpluses that congregations had, those surpluses were used to really, help the weaker congregations who may not necessarily be able to afford some of their bills, etc. But some of the congregations that had these surpluses, they wanted to do certain things and they thought their money was with the circuit. When they actually went to get their money, let's say they wanted to buy an organ, figuring that they had $50,000, the money wasn't there. And so they were able to successfully petition the connection to say that congregations can have their own separate accounts. And I think that's the breakdown of the whole circuit concept, where the weaker congregations are supported by the stronger congregations. And it does have some merit in the argument that, when these stronger congregations wanted money, they weren't able to get money. I think we need to find a balance between weaker congregations being supported and the stronger congregations not feeling like they're being taken advantage of all the time. Um, in addition to that, you mentioned persons giving of their time, talent, and service. And I think that's also very important. And I know that, for example, within the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they have musicians. Now, it's so interesting that a lot of our organists actually in a lot of our churches come from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They've trained these people to play the organ, to play the keyboard, etc. They have brought up these musicians. And they say to them, this is your ministry. You're offering this free to the church because this is your ministry. They then turn around and they charge us as Methodists for the services that they provide. How do we begin to identify our young people? And we've started to do it, I think, to some extent. Our young people who are interested in music ministry, and we invest in them. We send them to people who can teach them, the musical skills that they need, whether it's the organ, whether it is the keyboard, whether it's pan, whether it's the bass guitar. We invest in them and we get them to come back and to really work with us and serve. I wouldn't go as far as to say that we wouldn't pay you, because I think you should also honor someone and pay them for what they're offering. May not necessarily pay full scale market value, but you can, compensate them for their ministry and what they're offering. So how do we go about developing those programs further? And I think that's important. One of the things I wanted to point out was Kirtland made an interesting comment that as a church, we have a cash flow problem. And I think that that is a very, very, very good point. We do struggle with cash. How, as a church, can we improve our cash flow? And I really believe it has to be outside the whole concept of offering. As Reverend Joel rightly said, it's a situation where, we have older people who are on reduced salaries because they have pension, they're on pension, and we have young people who may not be working, who are children, and they're getting $2 from their parents to put in the collection plate. How can we improve our cash flow?
Let me respond to issues. This issue of cash flow isn't limited to the Methodist Church alone. You, I would personally have heard it, the church that my mom goes to, the pastor pleading with the persons that they're having issues financially. So it's not limited to the Methodist Church. I think churches across the board are struggling, even the ones that we consider to be, the prosperity churches, whatever, because people just don't have it. Coming out of COVID, some of the persons who were billionaires are now paupers. Some of the persons who were self-employed were not able to, apply their business for months. I know, especially in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, where we had the longest shutdown, I think, probably in the world. Um, Businesses, restaurants, some of these places weren't open. So persons just don't have it. Um, but as I said, that is just a symptom of the problem. And the problem being that we are not reaching people. Because I think we as ministers are at fault, church leaders. And I think that we're tradition. We've been doing things this way for years and years and years. So we think that's the only way it can be done. So we're going to continue to have the problem if we don't reconsider what it is we are doing as a church. And as it relates, the musicians, if we don't teach people that this is a ministry that they do unto God, persons are not going to be interested. They're not going to be dedicated to what they're doing. So as you correctly said, in the SDA church, they know that this is a ministry. And because it's a ministry, they're doing it unto God and not unto man. So from a very early age, some of them, while they're going to school, they identify that this is a ministry that they want to be a part of. And that is their ministry. At times in the Methodist Church, we behave as if being a member of the choir and being a steward are the only ministries that we can render or that we have as a church. Everything else is a social group, and so persons treat them like social groups. I have been involved with it for about maybe between 7 to 9 years. And when we just developed the dance ministry, I had to spend most of my time teaching persons that it's a ministry and not a dance group, because there is a difference. If you are a part of a dance ministry, then the same kind of dedication and training and lifestyle that you require from a presbyter or from a deacon is also going to be required from a dance minister, because you're not somebody who dances, you are someone who ministers through dance, and they minister through music. So for them, that is something that is very important. And just like when you have in different churches where when someone goes to another congregation and they are usually paid, the musicians are supposed to be paid in the same way, because that is a ministry that they are doing. So in the same way that you would pay a minister who preaches, shouldn't you pay the musician? I'm just playing devil's advocate, right? But the issue is, if we don't teach persons that they are a part of a ministry, then persons may do it for 2 to 3 years, and then it fizzles out because the person who was there to start it is no longer around. And you find that after years, persons get tired and they just drop it. But you would find that they keep asking for members to join the choir. They don't ask for persons to play the organ, but they want persons to be in the choir and they want persons to be stewards. Am I right or am I right? Talk to me.
You're definitely right.
Yes. And if I may respond as well, and that's something I fully agree in terms of expanding the scope of how we understand ministry, and beyond just choir and maybe being a steward. I think we also narrow ministry a lot to becoming a minister or a preacher. So we have to see church ministry in a much broader context. I fully agree with that. I also wanted to touch on the point Kirkland made in terms of the cash flow, and it's an immediate problem, but there might not be an immediate solution. And so the investments I spoke about earlier, I think the sooner we get going in terms of how we approach those things, I think it would be better. And beyond those things that I mentioned, for example, why isn't there a Methodist cafe somewhere, right? Because these are things that can help with the cash flow and reduce the reliance on a dwindling membership to meet some of our obligations. So we have to look broadly. And in the beginning, I spoke about doing a sort of mapping of church assets. I think what's also required is a mapping of our human resource assets. So among our congregations, um, who are all the who are all of the attorneys, who are all of the people involved in finance, just to have an idea of the kinds of human resources that we have within the church, uh, and how we can use some of those resources for ministry within the church, right? So, for instance, instead of the church perhaps going out and hiring an accountant to do something, there might actually be accountants right within the church who may offer their services as ministry to the church, right? You may have doctors in our congregations who may offer certain types of medical services as a ministry to the church. So that's all part of expanding what we understand ministry to mean. But also, we need to do a mapping of the skills gaps and deficits within our church. So, do we need musicians, and in what and what kinds of music do we need? Okay, I recall, and the other issue very quickly is that we have to start encouraging older members of our congregations to be a lot more flexible in terms of the kinds of worship experiences that our churches can express. I used to go to a church, Methodist church in Barbados. Had actually transferred my membership there, and I eventually left because I was no longer comfortable that there was enough of a room being given to young people to grow and develop and express themselves fully. And when I decided I needed to leave that particular congregation was at a time when a drum set was purchased, and a young man who was not even part of the congregation, but was borrowed from elsewhere, was brought in to play on Sunday mornings. And in that period in the service, there's some members, at least more than half of the congregation, who would refuse to stand and give God praise because they did not like the drum, and they may not have liked some of the more contemporary style music that was being played. And we cannot have a church that only meets the needs of some. It has to meet the needs of everyone, including our young people. And so those are some very serious conversations we need to have. And the older members of our congregations need to understand their responsibility to also ensure that the younger persons feel that they too have a place in the Methodist Church. And if that doesn't happen, then we'll continue to leak members from among the young people.
All very good points. I'm seeing Brother Kirkland saying that he would definitely love to see a Methodist owned cafe. I want to touch very quickly before I get on the point that I think Joel raised as it relates to having persons within the church give of their time, talent, and service. And I know there are some accountants who are very reluctant to get involved in the church because there is usually a lot of conversation talk from armchair accountants who may not necessarily be qualified when we get to our statutory meetings that they're doing things wrong and etc. And these persons are qualified and know what they're talking about. I may be very stubborn and in many ways push back on a lot of things that I get when I meet armchair lawyers, when I serve in various levels, whether it be on a district level, whether it be congregational or circuit wise and I'm giving legal advice, I do get pushback. And there are times where you're like, but I'm volunteering my time, I'm volunteering my services. Do I really want to put up with all of this? How do we get our members to appreciate and value the time and service that our professionals are offering to the church? And I think it's also even related to the point of appreciating and valuing the young people as they worship, as they have different forms of worship. And I think we have a lot of young people who leave the church because they don't feel valued, and they go to other places where their talents, their time, and their services are valued by others, and they're welcomed by others, and they feel loved and appreciated. I think that love and appreciation on all levels may be missing from our church. We have more people who chastise, tear down, and don't support individuals who are trying to serve. How do we change that culture?
Teaching, and more teaching. Congregational level, circuit level, district level, connectional level. As a church, we don't teach much, unfortunately. And that is where we have a lot of our breakdowns. Because if persons, as I said, see these different ministries, then yes, they argue with ministers, and they do argue with us a lot. But the kind of respect that are given to ministers that I am now seeing being given to dance ministers and to persons involved in like the legal bureaus and some of these things, as more persons become aware that this is a ministry, you would find that the attitudes would start to change. It is not an easy process. As a teacher, I can tell you that teaching and learning is not a one off. So, as Methodists, we like to have retreats and workshops, and you have one, and then 5 years pass before you have the next one. It is something that has to be continuous. So, just the same way I don't even know if we teach our doctrines in all of our congregations regularly, or if we just do it for confirmation class, and after confirmation is finished, we forget about that. But it has to be something continuous. So when we are doing discipling, we teach about these things. It's not going to happen on a Sunday morning, because Sunday morning worship is designed for a different purpose. But we need to make opportunities where our people can be nurtured spiritually as well as socially and professionally, because we are mind, body, soul, or mind, body, spirit. And if we try to separate out the different compartments, then we end up in the situation that we are in now as a church, where we believe that we are nurturing persons spiritually, but we ignore the other aspects of a human being. And persons will go where they have that whole experience. So we need to, in many aspects, return to our roots. Not our traditions necessarily, but our roots, where John Wesley or the Wesley brothers would have seen the suffering of their society, and they decided to do something about it. And at that time, the Methodist Church grew in leaps and bounds. If we go back to the early church, the same thing. Those who were in need, those who had would sell and they would share, and every day they were adding to their numbers. I don't know when as a church we stopped doing that, but I think that is when our problem started. And it didn't happen in one day, and so the solution will not be overnight either, but we have to start. And even when we may be frustrated with how members treat us or how they respond to us, if we understand that we are doing it not for people but unto God, us as a whole community to grow and to grow together. So don't grow weary in doing good, Brother Creig.
Thank you very much. Um, Dr. Joe, I see you muted your mic. You want to tackle that quickly?
The and especially on the issue of spiritual life, that my namesake Joel, I think part of it, because sometimes I'm baffled that as a church, because we're supposed to be different, we are called out, and some of the things that I experience in a secular environment, I do not expect to encounter in the church, because our mission, our ethos is supposed to be different. And it always baffles me at the lack of grace. And you mentioned this whole idea of love, Creig, earlier. And it baffles me that so often those things are absent in how we interact with each other in the church. Because if you really have the grace of God within and the love of God within and the love for each other, I do not understand how we would respond to each other in the way that we do sometimes. So that somebody offering their services, whether it be legal, accounting, or what have you, and a response would be one that isn't seasoned with any grace at all, to call out someone in a way that pushes them away and hurts. I think those are things we have to do some serious introspection, and we have to focus a lot more on, in addition to the teaching, but also the spiritual life of the church. We have to focus on those things. I just wanted to say that very quickly.
Excellent. There is one question that I think we need to answer before we actually end this conversation, and it's a question that came from our YouTube viewers, and it is: how does the church view wealth creation? Is wealth seen as a sin, and can we save our way to wealth? I don't know who's going to tackle that one first.
Well, quickly, I don't see wealth as a sin, and I don't see anywhere in Job, for example, was an extremely wealthy man. Abraham as well. These were very wealthy people. Solomon, you name them. It's the love of money that the Bible warns us against. And some of the, even when you look at the early disciples, apostles, and whatnot, they also needed resources. They really, and churches also relied on the financial resources of its members to be able to engage in mission work. So Paul would not have gone as far as he would have traveled had it not been for the benevolence of some of the churches among whom he worked. And the truth is, in order for the church to respond to a lot of the missional problems that are around us, issues of poverty and issues of inequality and issues of homelessness, right? We need resources, because in as much as it's very important for us to go to people with the message of the gospel, Jesus didn't only go to people with a message of salvation. He also went to people with, for instance, when he fed people, he was responding to a very real physical problem that they had, one of hunger. Right? When he healed people, he was responding to a very real problem of addressing their health situation. So, in order for us as a church to be more effective in mission in our communities, we also need to have the financial resources to do that. And for me, it's not wealth creation for the sake of wealth creation, but it is wealth creation to enhance the church's own mission and outreach to our communities.
Thank you for that. And I do agree with you. Unfortunately, in many aspects, that viewpoint seems to have become very unpopular as part of Methodist witness over the years. There is a sermon by John Wesley that talks about money. And, it talks about saving and using, out of what you have to help others. And, we would hear that John Wesley himself, when he started as a minister, received, I think it was like £28. And to the day that he died, that is what he lived on. And he used the excess to help others. Part of how the church was founded was that they met as a group, and they would go around, they would make their offerings, and they would take that to help those in the society. But I think over time, as Methodists, we would have missed the point of the widow's mite. That scripture in the Bible where Jesus, speaking to the scribes and Pharisees, talking about the corruption and the exploitation in the church, would have spoken about, those who were wealthy going and throwing a gift, while the widow would have given the widow's mite. She gave the last that she had. Now, the point of that was that this widow, or the widows and the orphans, were being exploited because instead of being taken care of, she had to give all that she had. And coming out of that misunderstanding, I think many Methodists, even today, when you talk about tithe and offering, they talk about the widow's mite. So the idea is not that we should not give and give generously. Again, this is where teaching is important. So the whole idea of tithing, limiting to 1/10, is what, as a Methodist church, we say, well, we're not going to preach tithing because we want persons to give more than the 10%. Some persons take that to mean that the Methodist church doesn't believe in tithing, so they would give $1, they would give $2, they're not going to contribute anything. And again, as I said, I don't know how it crept in, but for some persons, they see wealth as a sin. So as a Christian, you're supposed to be poor. I think it may have to do with how we talk about the prosperity gospel as well. Persons believe that the issue we have with the prosperity gospel is that persons get money. But the issue with the prosperity gospel is that you miss the point. The point is Jesus Christ. So yes, you can be wealthy. By all means, be wealthy. God wants us to have abundant life. But in being wealthy, don't forget about God. So does the church view wealth creation as a sin? At times it does, unfortunately, and that is part of the reason why we are in the situation that we are in. Can we save our way to wealth? Yes, we can. It's something that we don't do as a church, but it's something that we should encourage our members to save, whether they do it through a cooperative, through a bank, through a susu or a lenhan. Because as Joe correctly said, and as I have said on many occasions, as much as I believe in God and I love God, when I go to the grocery, I can't pay with the peace of the Lord be upon you. I have to pay with the currency of the nation in which I am living. And so money is a necessity. Our attitude to money is what makes the difference. So by all means, my brother or my sister, go forth and work and be paid for your labor. But in receiving your increase, do not forget the Lord. That is where our message should be. And that is what I would encourage persons to do from where I sit as a minister, but also as a believer who knows that God gives and gives abundantly. It is not God's will that his people perish. And so wealth is not something that we should run away from. What we need to run away from is forgetting the Lord. So pardon my small sermon, Creig, but I just had to chuck it in there.
No, I think that was definitely appreciated. Let me say thank you to Joel and Joelle. This has been an exciting conversation. I wish we had more time, but I think we have definitely gone over our time today. So thank you very much for taking part, for sharing your ideas and your views. And hopefully, I think those young persons who are watching, members of our church who are watching, that they were able to see the ways that we can invest. And based on what everyone has been saying, one of the major things that we need to do is to invest in our people so that they will reinvest into our church. I think that is the number one takeaway that I'm going to leave here with. So thank you all both very much. And I pray God will continue to bless you, guide you, and keep you. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. And thanks for the invitation. Continue to be blessed.
Thank you. Take care. Bye. God bless.